Hi, I'm Bart Everson, creative generalist for faculty development. And now that you understand some of the basics of HTML, it's time for an ultra super basic look at CSS. And the first thing you need to know is that CSS is an abbreviation that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So this is going to be an ultra basic quick look at how style works in web pages. Now, in order to really understand how this is implemented, we have to go back to something I think of as the Great Divorce, which happened around 1999 with the implementation of HTML4, which kind of divided HTML from a new way of governing the appearance of web pages. The idea was put forward that we use HTML for structure and CSS for presentation. In other words, HTML would govern what it is, CSS would govern how it looks. Or another way of remembering the difference is that HTML is the language that uses those pointy brackets, and CSS is the one that uses those curly brackets. And in fact, those have kind of become iconic of the two languages, the two related languages. So now you know why. But really, CSS did require a new way of thinking. It still may be a little challenging sometimes for people to divorce structure and presentation. Now, CSS information can live in three different places. It can be external to the web page itself, it can be internal, or it can be actually inline in actual HTML tags. So we'll look at all three of these in turn. The first idea of the external style sheet, remember that's what the SS stands for, style sheet, is the idea that you could have a separate document entirely from your web page. And your web page would just have a pointer in the HTML that points to the location of this external document, this external style sheet. And that external style sheet would contain all the rules governing the appearance of the HTML in the web page. And just to give you a for instance, here's what some of that style information might look like. We're not going to get into all the details right now, but you can see that this is targeting the HTML element, which you remember, I'm sure, H1, a first level heading. And then in between the curly brackets, we have a bunch of style information about how it's going to look. Okay, now, having an external document is all well and good. It really starts to offer a lot of power if you have this. If you have more than one web page, if you have a whole server full of web pages, they can all point to the same style sheet. You make changes to that one style sheet and you change the appearance of every page every page that points to it. Maybe your entire website. And so that can be very powerful, though it might be beyond what most of us are going to do in the learning management system. The second place where style information can live is it can be internal to the web page itself. It can be embedded within the web page. So we'd have the same style information as we saw before, only this time it has to be wrapped in HTML elements because it's actually in an HTML document. So we've just wrapped it with the style element of HTML. You remember our container model. We have the opening style tag and at the end the closing style tag. And in between that HTML we have CSS. And finally, the third and final place where style rules can live is when they're inline. That means actually in an HTML tag itself. So you'll remember again our H1 first level heading HTML tag following that good old container model, we see here in between the opening and closing tag, the content, really big deal, that would be our first level heading, as specified by HTML. We can expand that opening tag to include the style attribute, and then in between the quotation marks, we can actually put some style rules. Just one style rule in this case. We're just saying that the font size is going to be twice as big as you might expect. And that's it. So obviously, it's much quicker and dirtier to put it in this way. I say it's quicker and easier to put style information right in where you want to use it, but dirtier in a way in that it's just not as powerful, but it might be just what you need. So that's a quick overview of the concept of style and where it can live. Now let's get into a little bit more, just a little bit more of the actual syntax. It's very simple. You have a selector. We select what HTML elements we want to target, and then in between the curly braces, we have a declaration of the actual style rules. And those will take the form of property value pairs with a colon, property colon value. So here's a for instance. Oh, I almost forgot. Probably should put a semicolon at the end. If you only have one style rule, you can get away with no semicolon, but if you're going to have more than one, you need semicolons to separate them. And so it's probably a good habit to get into just putting a semicolon at the end of every style rule. So here we have an example. The selector is P, the paragraph, good old paragraph element from HTML. And in between the curly brackets, we have a very simple style rule. As you can probably discern, we're saying that the color should be red. In other words, the color of the text in our paragraphs should be red. If you put this style rule into a web page, it's going to make every paragraph have red text in the entire web page. Now you can have, for any selector, you can have more than one style rule in between those curly brackets, and this is where you really have to have those semicolons at the end. They don't have to be on a separate line, by the way. That's just a convenience for us as human beings reading this. But the software, the machines, they don't care so much about it being on a separate line. It can all be run together. And a lot of times that's how you'll see it when you're looking at style information in a web page out there on the internet. Now there's going to be a lot that I'm leaving out, but I did want to mention also the concept of class, because it's a very powerful concept that really extends the power of CSS. And we see here the syntax. We can specify for any selector a given class and apply that, or that can be the target for our declarations. To give an example, a paragraph in the warning class should be made red. That's what this style rule says. As you can imagine, this means that instead of making every paragraph red, we're only going to make certain paragraphs red. Paragraphs that are in a class called warning. Now, I know you're saying, Bart, what are you talking about? Classes? HTML elements can have classes? You didn't mention that before, and that's true. But remember, we said that virtually every HTML element can be expanded to include any number of attributes. Well, class is one of those attributes. So we have here an example of a paragraph tag. The opening tag has been expanded to include an attribute, the class attribute, and the value has been set to warning. Now, warning is just an arbitrary label that I made up. It could be almost anything. Warning is not a reserved word. It's not a part of HTML. So you can name these classes whatever you want. In this particular case, by naming it warning, I'm telling myself that there's a purpose to this kind of paragraph, and I might have a number of paragraphs throughout my HTML document, which I consider to be a warning. They might impart certain important caveats for the reader. And I can turn them all red with just a little style. Also, note that you can get rid of the selector entirely and just have dot warning. In other words, you can just target the class, no matter what element it's a part of. So this rule would apply to anything in the warning class, whether it's a paragraph or a heading of any level, list items, block quotations, and so forth. So as you can see, it can become very powerful. Now usually you don't have just one style rule. In a particular context, you're going to be looking at any number of them, potentially quite a few. Here I've got just three. I'm targeting three different elements and using three different selectors. You see that some of the rules are kind of run together, as I mentioned before. They aren't on separate lines, which does help for legibility. So I'll put them on separate lines just so we can talk about them. But if you're picking through somebody's code, you might see them all run together like that. Don't be thrown off. Now, what we see here is that first of all, we're targeting the body of the HTML document. We're just saying the whole thing is going to have a black background, and it's also going to have a padding of 10 pixels around the edge. Then the next selector is the div tag. You may remember that one of the most basic generic HTML elements is the div tag, which is just a generic division. And its generic quality is what makes it so powerful. It really can be almost anything that you want it to be, and usually that's governed by style sheets. So we create generic divisions in our web page, and we can apply styles to them. In particular, we might make a generic division and create a class called narrow, and then apply this particular style to it, where it's going to have a tan background. It's going to have a particular size font. The border will be, well, there will be no border. And we will have a 20 pixel padding around the edge, and we'll use a specific family of fonts, and we'll list the actual fonts that we want to use in kind of from more specific to more general, depending on, we don't know what the end user may have on their system. And we can set a specific width as well. And finally, there's the paragraph tag again. And for that, we're just setting a margin, a particular margin on the left and another margin on the right. And all of this is just to give you kind of a general idea of what style rules might look like. As you can see, there's a lot of vocabulary there. I'm not going to get into all of it. Certainly, it's beyond the scope of this brief little introduction. But there is one conceptual model that is worth noting that might help with all of this talk of borders and paddings and margins and so forth, and left and right, top and bottom. And that is the box model. Remember that HTML, as we mentioned when we talked about HTML, if you kind of squint, you'll see the big structure of a web page is kind of like big boxes. You can think of those as boxes of content, and that each box of content can have a padding around it. Well, it can, first of all, I should mention, it can have the width set explicitly through style sheets. It can have a padding around the content. There can be a border that would go around the padding. And finally, there could be a margin around the edge of the, that would go on the outside of the border. And we can target individually the left or right or bottom or top of any of these aspects. So content, padding, border, margin. This is the order in which it unfurls, which just helps you to know when you're messing around with styles where those rules are going to land. All right? Well, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but once we start putting it into practice, it's going to make a lot more sense.